Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have an excellent guest for you this evening. I'm excited to have Dr. Robert Gross. We met out in Phoenix last February, and he's a great guy. Before our guest this evening, we have, of course, Alejandro Rojas with the UFO Updates, and we are live now. For those of you on YouTube, you know that we changed our time, and we are also on KGRA Radio. I'm really excited about all the listeners over there, and I hope you enjoy the show. We're bringing you different guests every week. Last week was a humdinger with 3 different guests. We generally have one guest, but we may add some as we go along. It just depends on the circumstance. Almost had an additional person tonight, but it didn't work out, just to join in for a few minutes. But anyway, that may happen. I want to thank everyone that supports the show. Anyone can do that. And you can find that information over on podcastufo.com. So we are live on Tuesday evenings. That's 6 to 8 Eastern Standard Time on KGRA Radio, as I mentioned, and also on YouTube. You can also watch that right on the website, podcastufo.com. Over there, we have some blogs. We also have a UFO sightings page. People can post sightings anonymous. We have quite a few of them over there. Very interesting ones. So check that out when you get a chance. And so that's enough babbling for me right now. Alejandro, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Doing a lot better today, in fact. Yeah, I just remembered I owe the KGRA station an apology because I was sick yesterday, so I woke up like in the middle of the night thinking, uh-oh. Doing well. Really busy. And we'll be at AlienCon. Anybody who's going to be there in Pasadena this weekend, we're going to be just promoting the conference and selling some T-shirts and stuff. So,
great.
That's going to be fun.
Pasadena is always a great place. I go to the Rose Bowl flea market there when I'm out there. It's a blast.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I haven't been there, and I've heard it's gorgeous, so I'm really looking forward to it. We're staying at a really cool Airbnb.
Oh, wow. Great. Awesome. So what's going on for UFO news?
UFO news, there's not a whole lot. I mean, there's still that news that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks about the Nimitz UFO encounter.
Yeah.
Also, that information about, George Knapp shared about the government organization that did all of that and kind of how they were looking into Skinwalker and everything. So there's a lot of that going on still, and otherwise not a whole lot of new stuff. Couple new things that have been posted out there. One, Cheryl Costa did a story for the Syracuse New Times talking about how sightings are deteriorating. There's less and less sightings, at least that MUFON is getting. It's always difficult with those numbers because those numbers are very high level. Those are cases before they're investigated. And in my, examination of these, where I watch these numbers on a monthly basis as well, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it. Often it's due to awareness. So the more UFO television shows there are out there, especially ones featuring groups like MUFON, then the more UFO sightings that happen. And really, we haven't had a lot of UFO programs going on. Now, I know, and Bob may know this, there are a lot of production companies out there looking to do something.
Right.
And I know History Channel's working on a couple of things, but nobody's pulled the trigger on anything. So we'll see what happens. I think the hard part is everything's been done when it comes to UFOs. So it's hard to figure out a new angle. But yeah, what do you think of the numbers?
Yeah, I haven't really been paying, a lot of times I do look at them, but I haven't noticed just lately. So I guess I haven't really paid that much attention to the actual numbers, but they are down, and like a blanket number is down.
Yeah, kind of the overall number of sighting reports is down, but it's really difficult also to qualify. Does that mean, I think people then think, oh, the phenomena has subsided. But That's really hard to say. And Bob, your guest, can speak to this. We both belong to this group called the Scientific Coalition for Ufology.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, it takes a lot of work to qualify something as an unknown. And until you do that, you have a strong number of unknowns, you're not really going to be able to gauge the phenomena, the mystery itself, where the unknowns are strange. Otherwise, you're just kind of dealing with how the public deals with the situation. And with these numbers, you often see that where there's more people, there's more reports, which makes sense. Where there's more sunshine and better weather, you see more reports because people are outside and can see the sky more. So, so the way populations move have a lot to do with how things are reported, but don't necessarily reflect on the phenomena itself, I think. But
so in a way,
there's
sort of like it's sort of in a way pop culture influenced.
Right, very much so. It really is. I mean, when Hangar 1 was out, that MUFON television show, they had a huge increase in sighting reports.
Now let me ask you something. Do you know if Peter Davenport was getting a lot of sighting reports as well, or was it just MUFON?
He has those trends. His trends are a little different, but because he's not always featured. They're featured on shows. Sometimes they're featured on the same shows. Sometimes they're not. But yeah, you can see that trend, and if you ask him, he'll tell you that as well. He gets different media attention, but he does get media attention. So whenever he gets a story, let's say in a large media outlet, then he'll have an increase himself. So it's heavily influenced by the media attention that which makes sense, the marketing, the awareness that people get that they exist. And, when someone watches a TV show and, someone like Newfork or MUFON is mentioned, then they think, what, I had a sighting a couple years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or it even happens, what, I was there in that Roswell thing, so I'm going to report. I mean, that's how Kurt Russell, if you remember last year, reported and said, he was a part of the Phoenix Lights. He was from a television show. So that often produces, a lot of reports.
Now, you mentioned earlier there's some more on the Nimitz, and I did see there's a lot going on. I know there was some news. Let's see, Fox News ran something with Nick Pope, and I forget the... So a lot is happening. Of course, that started with the I-Team and George Knapp, getting Harry Reid to help out to find the documents. And I know you've done a lot of work on that, on the... what's the name of the website? The Geek? What is it?
I have Den of Geek. I'll have a story coming out this week. It's taking a long time for them to get it out, just because I take second billing to the sci-fi industries, entertainment industries news. So I have a story on the Nimitz coming out, and then I have another longer story on the program and its relation to Skinwalker Ranch and Bob Bigelow and that history, which will be coming out too, probably in their magazine. But one interesting part to this is that the SSE, the Society for Scientific Exploration, they've gotten some news, especially by George Knapp recently, because last weekend they had their big conference. And part of their conference was John Alexander, who lives in Las Vegas and was kind of the local host of the event, and then Hal Puthoff. And Hal Puthoff is a physicist who was involved with the Bigelow organization, the BASS, and this ATIP and A-SWAP, these different names that the Pentagon project had. So that was featured heavily at the conference. So John Alexander kind of took the higher level view, and then Hal Puthoff, having very intimate knowledge of the more recent investigations, discussed that and the Pentagon and that sort of stuff. I wish I could have been there, because I'm sure he shared information that he hasn't shared before. And I should note that John Alexander, who is a retired Army intelligence, he's worked in the defense industry. He did work with Bigelow and Skinwalker, and he was instrumental in helping organize the whole thing early on, years ago in the 90s.
Right. Wow. I did have a little back and forth with George Knapp, tried to get him to just drop in for a few minutes, but he said, get back to me in the fall. He's that busy. He's so busy all the time.
He is busy all the time. I mean, there's sweeps. I spoke to him. I speak to him periodically, and his messages will be really short during sweeps and stuff. But from what I understand, he is going to want to help to promote the Skinwalker documentary that Jeremy Corbell has just finished and will be out on iTunes soon. And so a lot of it has to do with him because he wanted to make a documentary of all of this early on, but he couldn't. He was asked not to, but he had videotaped. He had gotten a lot of footage. So this footage is now going to be part of Corbell's documentary, and George Knapp is a big part of that. So he's very excited that this footage is finally going to get out, and so he's going to be promoting it. Come the fall.
Now I know that you had Jeremy on recently. We had him on, I don't know, several months ago. But do you know exactly when that's going to be released? And is it only on iTunes or other venues?
I don't know exactly when. All I've heard is summer, and I believe that means very soon, in the next month or two. It will be on iTunes, but from what I understand, they haven't confirmed other distribution outlets, but they've gotten a lot of interest, and essentially they're in a position where they get to pick and choose. So there will be some other very large distribution outlets that they'll be coming through.
I see. Okay. Anything else going on?
I think that's about it.
Well, I do appreciate, as always, Alejandro. Thanks so much, and we'll be back with you next week. Right?
My pleasure, my friend. Yep,
Yeah.
We'll talk to you next week.
All right. Okay, everyone. So our guest tonight is Dr. Bob Wenzel-Gross. He's a semi-retired, I like that, semi-retired. I'm sort of semi-retired myself, but I work way too much, so I don't know if I qualify for that. He's also a researcher, a writer, presenter, an educator with, he has 2 nonfiction books out. Connecting the Phenomena is one, and I know he has also some white paper reports out there as well. We're going to be talking about all that. And welcome to the show, Bob. Dr. Bob, I should say.
Thank you, Martin. It's great to see you again. Great to be here.
Yeah. We met in February, and that was a lot of fun, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a terrific group, terrific conference.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you kind of, for the person hearing you for the first time, can you give them your basic background and, actually what made you interested in this topic overall?
Well, my professional involvement in the whole UFO phenomenon, I can go back further, but I'll just start there because I'm pretty old. And
Okay.
And we don't have that much time. But if I'll go back to 1984. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's good round number.
Yes. That's not when I was born, though. But in 1984, that's when I received my doctorate from Penn State. And my major was in music education. And my minor was in general studies. And because my doctoral dissertation involved electronic music, I was actually doing a lot of full-blown scientific experiments back then, working on turning analog sound into digital sound, which there really wasn't much as far as digital sound went back in 1984. And since I had a doctorate in music education, I thought I'd put that into good use. So in 1985, I decided I was going to write a children's musical. And I wanted the musical to be about something that was popular. And back in 85, things like battles in outer space and extraterrestrials and Star Wars and the movies E.T. and Star Trek and Star Wars were popular. So I decided I was going to write a musical about UFOs. And I thought that would really be popular for young kids.
Wow.
So I looked around the Pennsylvania area, and I located a group from Pennsylvania. It was a clearinghouse known as the Pennsylvania Association for the Study of the Unexplained. And I joined that organization. I think it was in April of 1985 to learn as much as I could about UFOs for my children's musical that I was writing. And that's what kind of really kicked off my formal studies in, studying about the whole UFO phenomenon.
Wow. And so did you really enjoy the organization? And I'm trying to think, is that the one, I'm trying to think of who the main person that's on the study. He's been on the show so many times.
It was Stan Gordon.
Yeah, that's him. Yeah, is he part of that? He is, isn't he?
He was at that time. Back in 1984, 85. Yes. And so that was the group I worked with and that's why I started learning and became a field investigator. And I was with that group for a few years. And in 1987, they had a national UFO Information Week that PASA as well as MUFON from Seguin, Texas, they sponsored it. And they held this event at the Greensburg Mall, which is in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. So I attended that event. And to make a long story short, it was very well attended. I'd say over 1,000, maybe a couple of thousand people attended this mall. And I actually, when I was there, the event was at I think it was like the west end of the mall. And I was walking around the north end of the mall, listening in on people's conversations. And there was this group that was gathering at the north end of the mall, far away from where the displays were. And I kind of wormed my way in to hear what was going on. And what it was, where there were two witnesses describing what happened at the Kecksburg case back in 1965. And that was the first time that I think witnesses came forward. This was in 87, so 22 years later, with testimony about the Kecksburg case. So I was like thrilled to hear all that. And back in 85, I did happen to hear the Kecksburg case unfolding on KGRA Radio. That's why I became kind of obsessed with the whole Kecksburg case. So really got my heart pumping to hear witnesses give testimony about what happened that night on December 9th back in 1965 at Kecksburg. So I was kind of hooked in the whole UFO phenomenon field at that point.
Wow. Now I know Stan Gordon, that it's kind of like his baby in a way, Kecksburg. I actually had him on debating John Ventry along with someone else when it came to one of the satellites. But you have you came up with a different satellite that you think this could have been, right? Am I getting that right? I see the Skype screen is frozen, and looks like our guest is frozen. So hang on, everyone. I'm not sure. I might have to ring him back. Just hang in there if you would. Let's see. All right. And let's see. I'll add him to the call and see what happened. So we did a test ahead of time. Everything was good. So we will just have to continue on. So live listeners, thank you for hanging in here. And he is not picking up in Skype. So not as of yet. He may call back. So at this point, so the Kecksburg case, 1965, there were several witnesses. It's really quite amazing. This thing shot across the sky, and then it did some type of angle turn, and it was very bright and very low, and people were saying that it appeared to be moving along rather slowly with like a stream of fire behind it. So it landed in the woods, and I think Stan Gordon, who we were mentioning earlier, was actually listening to the radio live. I'm hearing strange noises there, Dr. Bob. Can you hear me on this side? We're going to have to hang up. You're sounding very much like Alvin and the Chipmunks. So we're going to hang up on you and try again. I'm going to get you to start singing some Christmas songs here. All right, so we'll try him again. He did come across visually, but that was. I'm going to keep that recording in. I like that. It's very alien sounding. So this thing crashes in a wooded area, and there were some eyewitnesses. He's coming back again. Let's see how he sounds. Dr. Bob.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do you know what happened on your end?
No, everything just went black.
Yeah, it's definitely the government. They always do that.
That happened a few times.
Yeah. All right. Well, whatever. If you didn't do anything, I can't tell you not to do it again. So
yeah, everything just went totally black.
Wow. All right. So you're not up visually yet. So when things like this happen, I can't. It seems to me that I asked you a question. Of course, you didn't hear it. So we were talking about you were getting interested in Kecksburg, and also I started telling the listening audience basically what happened there. I didn't really get into anything much further than the thing doing a zigzag in the sky, it crashing in the woods. But do you want to just go over what you know about that story in particular?
The Kecksburg Incident started now. I can see myself, by the way, in the corner of the video, which I couldn't before, so I don't know what that means. But
yeah, you're not on visual right now, which is fine. So
this was in 1965, and in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. What happened? It was around 4:47 p.m. on December 9th, 1965, and there were hundreds of witnesses in several different states, and including Canada, that basically saw this fireball coming in a southeasterly direction. And when the fireball got to about Ohio, it slowed and it made a turn left and started heading towards Pennsylvania. And when this fireball got between, I think it was Latrobe, Pennsylvania, and another a little community, it made a right and started heading south. And then when it got south, it made a U-turn and headed up. It landed in Kecksburg, and it made a semi-soft landing in the woods in Kecksburg. And right before it landed, it kind of morphed from a fireball into a four-pointed fiery star. And at that point, when it was reported on the KGRA Radio and KGRA television, a lot of people started hearing about it, and they started traveling out to Kecksburg. Now, my parents wouldn't let me go out. I was only 17 years old at the time. I'm not a very good driver, and they would not let me travel 53 miles in their relatively new car out to Kecksburg. But and I thought the whole thing ended right then and there. But so later on that evening, there were quite a few people who got there. Some of the witnesses, like that I heard in 1987, give testimony. There were groups of people that got into the woods before the police and the army arrived, and they saw this object lying in the woods in kind of a shallow riverbed or creek bed, and it was an object that was a large acorn-shaped object that was shiny gold in color. and it had a protuberance on the front that some people reported looked like a burnt orange colored trash can.
Huh.
And also the object was giving off really bright flashes while it was there on the earth, on the ground, should we say.
Hey, we're gonna have to end it right there. We'll come back to it here. We have a break. So we'll get right back on that. And you were just basically talking about what people said they were witnessing. So hang in there. We are coming up on a break now. So you're listening to Podcast UFO on KGRA Radio. My guest is Dr. Robert, or Dr. Bob, as he likes to be called, Gross. And we'll be right back after this commercial break.
All right, gang, we've got 3.5 minutes in this break.
All right, very good. Thank you. So just to let the YouTube listener know, so the way things have to go, the only way I can keep this show basically going on YouTube and KGRA Radio at the same time is, first of all, have no intro or outro music. Unfortunately, that may change, or that will change. KGRA is getting a new board, and so that'll be coming up for music. As far as the breaks go, so I had two choices. I can end the stream and basically put everyone on hold, or you can hear the chit chat behind the scenes. So I figured most people would enjoy that a little bit more than for me just putting the whole show on pause. So that's what we're going to do. So if you're listening to YouTube, whether you're watching it later or you're watching it live, you're just going to hear behind the scenes chit chat during the breaks. You won't hear the commercials actually. So anyway, Bob, we'll get back to that. Where you were talking about. Very interesting. There's so many turns and twists in this particular case. It's really fascinating.
Yes.
And especially when people are talking about, possibly the thing being transported to Wright-Patterson, but we'll get into all that. Are you still living in the Pennsylvania area now?
No, I left the Pennsylvania area in 1992 when I first started working with the government. But I was a teacher. I taught in the schools, in the public schools, and at the Penn State University, as well as Indiana University of Pennsylvania, for 23 years. And then I was an administrator for 17 years.
Wow. So doing the math, you are an old guy.
Yes, sir.
I'm just teasing. So, wow. So what state do you live in these days?
Right now, I live in the state of Indiana.
Ah, uh-huh. And what's the UFO sightings like in that state? It's not really high, is it?
No.
I mean, I can't think of a single case.
It's pretty low. There's some in Indianapolis, but other than that, there's not a lot.
Yeah. I can't really think of any particular case. There's quite a few in Illinois and Ohio. I know of some that were there, but Iowa, Indiana. I just can't think of too many things going on out in that area.
No, it's not that. There's not that many people that really get into that type of thing here, as compared to other places like Texas and so forth.
Oh, so Monica in the chat room says, "Cool, another Hoosier."
Yes, I am now.
You are now, so a transplanted Hoosier. Yeah. So in the chat, just if anyone has any questions, I'm going to be able to take them later on. Also, it seems to me as we were starting the show, we had some issues with Skype. I'm not sure exactly what's going on with that, so we may not be able to take any calls this evening. We are going to be having another call number through KGRA.
We're all set to go.
Okay,
my friend.
Go ahead. Count down.
I don't want to bang in on you there.
No problem at all. No problem.
All right, here we go. Let's get back on the air in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hey, welcome back to Podcast UFO on KGRA Radio. That's kgraradio.com. My guest is Dr. Bob Gross. Very excited to talk to him tonight. We were talking before the break about Kecksburg and the crash and what people were seeing. Now, Bob, so there were people that actually ventured deep into the woods where this thing crashed, right?
Yes.
And
Quite a few.
the witnesses you spoke to or you heard speak at the mall that evening, were any of them people that actually went into the woods?
Yes, according to what these two witnesses, and they were both gentlemen, according to what I overheard that day at the mall, both of them actually wandered into the woods right after the object landed. But it appeared like they were on opposite sides of the object. One male individual was by himself, and the other individual was with a group of friends, and they allegedly had flash cameras with them.
I'd never heard that part. So were pictures taken?
Now, at that event in 1987, yes, the witness claimed that they were taking pictures of the object that fell. And that witness claimed that the bright flashes that the first witness saw were possibly coming from the flash bulbs on the cameras that he and his friends were using that night. But as you know, like later on when I was doing my research, there indicates that there was a strobe light on the device, on the film bucket that was actually in the woods that night. So that also would have been causing those bright arcing lights to appear. But one witness did claim that he and his friends had snuck into the woods before the police and the military got there, and they did have cameras with them, and they took pictures of them. And this was probably, again, 87 might have been the very first witnesses to ever testify about seeing something at Kecksburg that night.
When these people were in there was the military came, right?
Yes, the military got there. There's a discrepancy as how quickly they got there. They got there pretty quickly after the object did a semi-soft landing in the woods. And allegedly they hauled it away. The military hauled it away.
So was the if this thing can be explained as the satellite, we're going to get more into that. Why all the secrecy? Can you explain why that was the way
yes.
handled, the way it was?
I can, from my research, in a couple of different ways. The one thing is that there was a satellite program known as the Corona Satellite Program that existed at that time. It was top secret, so no one knew anything about it. And that program existed from about 1959 to 1972. And that program was a spy satellite program where the satellites were launched mostly from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And then they took photographs of places in Russia and China and so forth that the United States was interested in. And that was a top secret program. And that's one reason that they wouldn't tell anyone, because these top secret programs didn't become declassified until 1996, I think it was. Now, at the same, go ahead. You have a question?
No, go ahead.
At the same time, I found out that the Air Force and the CIA were co-producers of the Corona program. At the same time, I found out that some Corona satellites were being used to test the radioactivity in the atmosphere, because Russia and the United States and China were exploding essentially atomic bombs in the atmosphere. And they were trying to keep track of how heavy the radioactivity was getting.
Now,
so that's two reasons they could have been using that.
Okay. Now, I think I heard you say just a few minutes ago the film bucket. I know that they used to, take the images via satellite and drop the film. This is not what you're thinking this particular case was just a film bucket, is it? Or is it?
It was a film bucket, but it was also, the film bucket is inside of a recovery vehicle.
Ah.
The recovery vehicle almost looks like a nose cone. It's also a type of a capsule. And the recovery vehicles have not only retro rockets, but they also have stabilization jets, and they can be steered.
Okay, so that explains the case of it taking a zigzag in the sky.
Exactly.
And so how did it come down though, and in such an area, a rural area, but still somewhere where it could have caused damage? Did something fail?
I don't know that something failed. They did have a double parachute system, and witnesses that heard the recovery vehicle passing overhead at about 200 feet could hear it hissing. So it was using its stabilization that was using bottled type gas to power it as well. Witnesses could hear it hissing. So that could have slowed it up. And it also had a double parachute system, which it would have deployed. And that double parachute system had four, they were like explosives that were tied to these devices that would have ejected the parachute out of the recovery vehicle. So you had those two things going for it that could have slowed it down. And also the trees, some of the trees were damaged, but it could have gotten to that speed where it could have landed without too much damage.
So someone just posted in the message board, which I think is a good question. So obviously, if the military showed up there, they were tracking what was going on. Obviously, is that so?
Yes, sir. They had the film bucket also had a type of tracking device on it. It had an antenna and a tracking device. That was part of the film bucket itself. So that's how they could have tracked it the whole time.
Well, this is, so it was definitely a UFO for the people that watched it because it was unidentified to them.
That's quite true.
Yeah. And what about now? Are there some people that are just hanging on tightly to this thing being, either extraterrestrial or, just a plain UFO, unknown? Or are people more or less coming around to the idea that this was some type of satellite?
Funny you should say that, because after I did my presentation at the International UFO Congress, I thought there was going to be quite a few people bothered by the fact that and I had all the evidence, because I had over 400 slides and so forth of the research that I did. And not one person complained. In fact, several people came up afterwards and thanked me for solving that riddle. So,
isn't that great?
And even I had attorneys and law professors coming up that day or the day after I presented, and everyone said, thank you for solving that mystery. And, up until a few years ago, I was always tossed between it was some type of deep space probe or possibly a UFO from another planet of some sort. But actually, I just, by chance, for some other research I was doing for another presentation in Texas, I started running across the information that was declassified. And it fit like a T. It just kept coming at me. I have like thousands of pages of documentation that shows that that's probably what it was.
All right, so there's some people that have written books on, the Kecksburg as a UFO. Do you know if they're actually still hanging on to the idea, or do you think that, I know how people they get vested in like a story, and they don't want to give up that idea. Have you had any backlash from anyone?
None. In fact, right before there was an article that I put together that was published in the UFO Chronicle that explained, what I found in my research, and I let everybody know that I was going to have this article published. Gave them a heads up, and just out of professional courtesy, and not one person complained. I even contacted the town of Kecksburg, the fire department there, that has a number posted, and I let them know that, hey, before this goes out, I want to let you know, and here's what I'm going to be saying in my report, and nobody even got back to me.
Now they have a monument there. Someone spent some money on a monument.
Yes.
Yeah. So, wow. And I think it's great that when a case, even though, this is going back some years, have you heard from any of the witnesses?
You mean of the Kecksburg event?
Yeah.
Not that I can recall, no. I have not heard back.
I would think that those people, if anyone at all, would really like to know about the decoding of what actually happened, and just to kind of put it behind them.
Well, there is one witness, and I don't want to mention his name, that I spoke with, because I also let him know about what my report, and he agreed with me.
Oh. Well, that's good. That's good. Now, what about you? There's stories, of course, and there's one of the stories that you hear about Kecksburg is this thing going to right field. I think it was called. I don't know if it was Wright-Patterson and then.
Yes, it was.
Okay, so it goes there supposedly. Someone talks about a hangar being guarded, and walking in and seeing an alien arm hanging off of a table. Now, this is all from memory, from talking to other people. I may have some things wrong about this case, and so forgive me if that's so. But have you looked at any part of that?
Yes. And let's call it the film bucket. It was a gold-plated acorn-shaped device.
Mm-hmm.
That was transported to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So I did some research, and this is what really turned the case for me. As I think I mentioned earlier, I did my doctoral work at Penn State.
Yes.
And Penn State has a nuclear reactor there. Not most universities don't have one.
Yeah, I would say.
And when I was doing my doctoral work, I had to put 3 terms on that main campus. So I, hung around the nuclear reactor quite a bit. That's why I have such a glowing personality. But the whole idea was that Penn State was the leader in nuclear waste control at that time, and a Dr. Eric Walker was heading that up. And during the time of the Kecksburg incident, Dr. Walker was also president of Penn State. And he was actually sighted at the Kecksburg landing site that night in December of 1965. And he was supervising the removal of anything that would have been contained in that film bucket. And there were also witnesses that claimed that they saw people in what they called moon suits, which were radiation protection suits, walking around in the woods of Kecksburg that evening, and they were also carrying large boxes. And doing my research, I found out that those large boxes were used to put radioactive materials in, just in case they were doing radioactive or nuclear emulsion experiments on those in those film buckets, which they were. So they actually then transported that recovery vehicle into film bucket to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and somebody did see it there in a hangar, and the device was sitting in such a way that there was like a parachute device. It was underneath a parachute device. So I found photographs of another film bucket on display at a science conference, and it was on display under a parachute. The parachute was above it, and the film bucket was beneath it.
So you're thinking when that person peered into the hangar, they were seeing basically the film bucket with the parachute over it?
Yes.
But no arm dangling. I guess that...
I didn't. The arm, the only thing that the arm could have been, okay, and I went through this as a possibility, because there could have been a variety of different nuclear experiments on board that film bucket, because the NASA and the government did not describe that experiment like other experiments. I looked at every single launch of a Corona satellite that I could get a hold of, and most of them had the nuclear experiments that were inside. They had them described. This is the only flight that I found, the only mission I found that did not have the nuclear experiment described. So I went through a whole scenario of, I found out the kind of nuclear experiments that could have been on board that satellite. And one of them was they were doing experiments with monkeys.
Oh, no.
Yeah. They weren't letting them to drive them or anything like that, but they were putting monkeys in these types of buckets along with some type of radioactive material to see how the cosmic radiation would affect a monkey. And I found pictures of these monkeys while they were still at home, and they were wearing a type of suit that looked like it was made out of chainmail that I guess protect the monkey in case the capsule caught on fire. So the only thing I could think of is that maybe they trained the monkey, that there could have been a monkey in one of those experiments that they trained to open up the capsule somehow. So, but I don't know that for sure, but that's the only way I could think of that kind of an arm sticking up.
Wow. So that's a possibility. And now, how many of these Corona satellites in particular did you find out that were launched?
Oh, there were like, I don't have my numbers in hand, but it was like 140, 200. I think there were somewhere around 200 that were launched from 59 to 72. And there were quite a few that didn't return.
Oh, I was going to ask you that. The second question is, were there any other incidents that you're aware of that were similar to Kecksburg,
yes.
Or did things go into the ocean? I mean, 70% water.
Well, some went into the ocean, but there was one that went into Venezuela.
Oh.
And the farmers found it and returned it. It wasn't recovered, it was returned. And I have photographs of that.
Oh my God. So did they, were they, checked out for radiation poisoning or anything? Do you know?
Probably not by the time they found it. I was reading some reports that one of the farmers that found it, they took the silk parachute cords and they made suspenders out of it.
Wow.
So I haven't heard what happened to him.
Yeah.
But there were it was funny because like after that event, they started putting signs on the film buckets in 8 different languages saying that there would be a reward if you returned this to the United States.
Now, people did report that they saw, but I thought it was like hieroglyphics or something.
Well, there was reporting of seeing symbols around the base of that acorn.
Oh, symbols.
You can imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I did again some further research, and the people reported that there were circles and stars with dots in the center and straight lines and broken lines that were making up those symbols. Well, the Phillips Laboratory was in charge of the nuclear experiment that was on board that recovery vehicle. And their symbols were, they used what's called, you're familiar with the Zia symbol from being in the, the Southwest. And also, so that could have been their symbol, and their company, the Phillips Laboratory symbol, used the Zia symbol and stars with circles in the center. So they could have been those symbols that were etched onto the base of the film bucket, because I did find reports of the satellite preparers writing on the film buckets, labeling them to let anybody who recovered the film bucket know what was inside of that film bucket.
I see.
So it wasn't unusual to have some kind of symbols on the buckets.
Okay, so someone mentioned there's a couple of things coming up in the chat. We're going to break in about 4 minutes, so I do want to just ask, someone did mention that there were reports of the eyewitnesses saying that there were no seams. They saw no seams, no rivets or anything like that. Do you think it's just the angle they were looking at, or what did you think when you came across that part of it?
No, the film buckets themselves were layers of like a synthetic plastic and gold. It was actually gold plated. It was smooth. There were no rivets, nothing like that on it. So it was a perfectly shiny, smooth gold acorn-shaped object.
Okay, so we have Bobby, a regular listener in our chat room, and he's making a pretty good point, and I think so anyway, and that is he says he's not buying the theory, and I'm not saying that I'm not buying it, but this part I do agree with him. The government would have come out long ago and said, sorry, this was ours, had nothing to do with a UFO. How come the government, it's been 53 years now? So why didn't the government come out and say, hey, look, this was ours, it's declassified now, all that stuff? The
NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, they're kind of in charge of that. And I checked with them back in 2007, and they said a lot of their projects are still classified.
Really?
Now, yes. And I have the evidence that shows that. Also, here's another thing to think about. Let's say that one of the experiments they were doing, nuclear experiments at that time, they were putting small atomic bombs inside those film buckets. Not big ones, but small ones.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And those, if they were using atomic bombs for that experiment, which was not described, they still cannot release that information.
That is just crazy that they would do something like that.
Oh, they did it all the time. Right? What's odd about Kecksburg is the Chinese exploded an atomic bomb larger than the one that was used in Japan on May 14th of 1965. They dropped it.
And dropped it where?
In Japan, but it was still airdropped, and it would have caused, in fact, it did cause pulverized plutonium to go into the atmosphere.
Wow.
So that's my thinking, is that they could have been trying to measure how much damage that bomb did just a few months before the Kecksburg incident happened.
I see. Wow.
But
And
those things are still a secret.
wow. Okay. So we're coming up on the break here in a minute, and I do want to talk about Kecksburg a little bit longer, but also I know that you were saying that there's some type of relationship between Kecksburg and Roswell, so we'll get into that in the second hour. So, all right, so we're coming up on the break, and you're listening to Podcast UFO on KGRA Radio, and my guest is Dr. Bob Gross, and we'll be right back after this commercial break.
All right, gang, we're in the clear, and there's 3 minutes in this break as well, guys.
3 minutes, very good. And just go ahead and interrupt when we hit the end of that.
I will. And do you want to go commercial free in the back half?
Yeah, if that's okay.
That's okay with me.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, I'll be back in about 2 minutes.
All right, sounds good. So, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about Roswell. I always have my blanket argument about Roswell when they say there's nothing to see here, so we'll be talking about that. So if you're just joining us now on YouTube, I know Bobby is just now, what you're going to hear until some things possibly change on KGRA Radio on their end, for now, we're going to be having the breaks. The only way we can do the YouTube live stream at the same time as KGRA Radio is to have the breaks, kind of live breaks, really, and no intro music and no outro music. So we have a music-free show now on YouTube, and with the breaks behind the scenes. So, Bob, you having a good time so far?
Yes, sir. How are you?
Yeah, having a great time.
Did my photograph ever come back up on the screen?
Oh, let's work on that now. So
no, that's okay. I can see it. For some reason, it's on the corner of my screen. I can see myself, which I couldn't before.
This is what I'm going to ask you to do, and pardon me for people listening live. So if you can figure out by moving your mouse over your Skype screen, you'll see a camera. And if you click the camera off and click it back on, let's see if we can get that back up.
You want me to do that?
Yes, you have to do it on your end. Yes. So don't hang up on me.
I don't know how to work Skype, so I'm just using something that looks like a camera.
Yeah, you're going to just take your mouse over your entire Skype screen. You should be able to see your camera, or go into Skype preferences. And I bet someone listening live right now could tell you exactly how to do it. I have a Mac on this end, so I don't know how to work on it.
I see the camera image inside of a little blue circle.
Okay, so you're going to want to click on the camera, and then click it again after.
Now it's going to line through it.
Okay, now click it back again. There you are. You're back. I see you now.
Hey, I'm in the corner too.
All right, it worked. All right. So yeah, we'll have you back on video now, Evan. So
I don't know if that's a good thing or not.
Yeah, Evan. So you can take over that part of it if you would. So anyway, I think we only have like a minute and a half or something like that, and so I see the background in your room there. It looks like do you really travel that much? Look at those suitcases.
Yeah, those all actually have projects in them. Those are all separate projects that I'm working on.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
All right, 20 seconds, guys.
All right, that sounds good. All right, so we're going to be talking about Roswell, and we'll kind of wrap up Kecksburg. Just tell me when you get down to the 5. Well, you always do anyway, so we'll be ready here. It was a long 20 seconds. Hang in live, listeners.
All right, here we go. Stand by.
Yep.
Bumper's rolling here. All right, here we go. In 5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome back to Podcast UFO on KGRA Radio. That's kgraradio.com. My guest is Dr. Bob Gross, and we were talking about Kecksburg. We're just getting ready to just about wrap that up. So I think it's interesting, and you're fairly convinced that you figured out that this is what fits. Now, let me ask you about this. I know it was John Ventry together with someone else, and I'm sorry, they were both on the show. They had a different satellite, a GE satellite, right? I mean, that they were thinking was something.
Mark II.
What's that?
The Mark II GE.
Right. And this had nothing to do with that, in your opinion.
I had some lengthy discussions with one of those two gentlemen, and at the end of we were comparing notes, and they agreed that my solution fit better.
Oh, that's so nice to hear.
And I have it in writing.
You're a smart man. Wow. So,
but I'm not going to release it.
Yeah. Now, they were actually on my show, and they debated Stan Gordon. Now,
yes, I heard that show.
Oh, you listened to the show? So,
oh, yeah.
And what do you think? What is Stan Gordon thinking these days? What's his stand on it now, as far as you know? Can you answer that?
I have no idea. I had talked to Stan a couple of years ago and emailed him when I was living in Texas, because I was thinking about starting a collaborative where of people who were basically individuals who use the scientific method to solve phenomena. And I started collaborating with him when I was living in Texas. And back then, he was asking me if I had any new ideas about the Kecksburg Incident. And I mentioned to him, I think I mentioned to him about the Dr. Eric Walker being there, but I hadn't pursued that yet. So I know he was still looking at the Kecksburg case, and this would have been around 2013. I have some email communications with them, and when I was ready to release that article, I did contact the fire. There was a number on Stan Gordon's website, and it said to call that number if you had any other information. And I called them and said, "Hey, get ready. I'm getting to release this." And they said they'd get back to me, and they never did.
So Stan's a very thorough and reasonable guy. So as far, every time I've talked to him, which he's been on the show, I think 4 or 5 times, very reasonable, intelligent. I think that he would be happy. Next time I talk to him, I'll ask him. But I think that he'd be happy that it's solved. I don't think that he would be one of these people that tries to hang on to, older thoughts. And
well, he never. He always had that it could have been a man-made object in his possible solutions, as far as I've known him. I'll be honest with you, I was a little disappointed in his approach to John Ventry, that show that you had, because there's some things that I know that Stan doesn't know that should have not been, included in the mix. And I don't want to talk about those, but there are some things that I felt bad for John Ventry a bit, because there's some other things that I found out that go deeper into what they were talking about.
I see. Well, we're going to be talking about, of course, Kecksburg as we go along here when it comes to the Roswell case. But let's jump into that. I don't think that there's any reason at all we have to explain what happened or what supposedly happened at Roswell. I think, as far as the United States goes, there's no other case so well known. I guess this happened, around in early July 1947, just a few weeks after the Kenneth Arnold sighting. There was kind of UFO mania going on. People were seeing saucers everywhere, and I do believe people were seeing something. And there's people that have theories about the so-called modern UFO. I don't want to say flap or movement or whatever, but modern UFOs starting in 1947. I know I've spoken to Stan Friedman. He thinks it's very possible that if it is extraterrestrial, and he does think that some UFOs, he always says some UFOs, that they saw, our nuclear explosions, and they came to see, the kids found the matches, so they came, to explore us. So that's one of the reasons Stan says he thinks, the activity started in 1947. And by the way, for those people that don't know, Stan Friedman he's 81, I think. He's going to be retiring very soon, and I'm attempting to get him on as a retirement show on this on Podcast UFO upcoming. However, I spoke to Kathy Martin. She says he is going to retire. He doesn't have, a retirement date, so to speak, out there as of yet. But so 1947, something happened, and let's hear your side of it.
I wasn't born in 1948, so I had nothing to do with it.
Okay, you're in the clear, just barely. Yeah.
Somewhat.
Yeah.
But yeah, this whole thing is very interesting to me. I love doing research, and it's odd how I ran into the whole idea of the Roswell case, because I never knew about Roswell. I knew about Kecksburg because I saw it or heard it unfold on the car radio when I was a kid. And how I found out about the Roswell case in the first place, I was doing research for my doctoral degree at Penn State at Petit Library, their main library, and they have these huge stacks of books. This was before the internet or anything. And I was looking for some research about music, and there was these were such huge stacks of books that actually rumor was that someone was murdered in there. And I've got excuses. I wasn't the one, and it was these huge stacks of books in the middle of nowhere. And I was doing research, and I turned around behind me, and there was that Roswell book. I think the one that was published around 78 or so. I think it was
with
the one
William Moore and
yes,
Stan Friedman, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I saw that, and it was like someone put a spotlight on it. So I picked it up, and I forgot all about what I was doing, and I took that book over to one of the little tables at the library, read the whole book, and didn't do what I was supposed to do. Okay? So that was like 1982. So I've been researching that, and when I started doing the Kecksburg case, I started noticing that a pattern was starting to show up in the Kecksburg case. So I wrote down these points. Do you mind if I read them to you?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so this is what I found with the Kecksburg case. These are commonalities and elements from a pattern that I found in the Kecksburg case. And I wasn't really looking for a pattern, but it showed up. But first point was debris, including unfamiliar space-age metallic materials, was observed and recovered near the crash site. Another characteristic, the U.S. government was involved. Third characteristic of the pattern I found, at least 2 contemporary covert projects that collected secret data were entangled. Fourth, at least one of those covert projects had a lengthy, multiple-year research and development cycle. Next, the government, ufologists, skeptics, and others contributed to disseminating a rare combination of unreliable and conflicting information. And I think 6, extraterrestrial hypotheses were proffered. And the 7th point, I think that's 7, a failure of imagination seemed to permeate the initial and subsequent investigations. Now, that's only part of the pattern I found. I found other components to this pattern, and I'm not releasing them yet until the book comes out. But I found those 7 components in the Kecksburg case. When I started looking at the Roswell case then, since it was another one of my favorites, those same 7 points plus showed up.
Plus.
And that's...
So we'll talk about the
Yes.
plus, too. Okay. So here's the blanket argument that I always have about Roswell when it comes to the fact of, people arguing that Roswell was, say, something military, the mogul, that's one of the explanations, or the weather balloon and all that. So my blanket argument is that why on earth, we'll pull over the headline to the newspaper. So why on earth would the RAAF even admit that they captured a flying saucer on the ranch? I mean, and I'm going to say, why would they admit it rather than say nothing at all? Because they clearly didn't have to say anything at all.
This is now, I've got to go into a little bit more background about what I found so I can explain that.
Okay.
But there is a logic, there's a logical explanation to that. And the Roswell Army Airfield, okay, that was located in Roswell. One thing that helps put the whole Roswell, let's call it, incident in perspective is New Mexico. And I don't know how familiar you are with New Mexico.
Oh,
but
pretty familiar. Mm-hmm.
And I lived, my first exposure to New Mexico was in 2001, right after the 9/11 incident.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of shook me up quite a bit. So I joined, since I never was in the armed forces officially, I joined AmeriCorps. I basically put what I was doing as a professional administrator on hold, and I joined AmeriCorps, which is like the domestic Peace Corps. And that's where it took me to Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is in the southern part of New Mexico, to work with AmeriCorps. And I was in New Mexico from about 2001 to around 2010, and I got to travel all over that state working for the government and other projects. And I talked with a lot of people and met a lot of very interesting people. And New Mexico itself has a pretty unique cowboy culture. And you've got to figure that into the mix.
Uh-huh.
That's an important part. And so the whole idea that in 1947, they were working on Project Mogul. Okay, and actually Project Mogul was started in around 1946. And Mogul was used to test to see if the Russians or whomever were exploding atomic bombs in the atmosphere. Because it was like kind of tracing, in the ocean, allegedly, there's like an acoustic channel that travels. And there was one scientist, I believe his name was Ewing, that came up with a concept. And don't trust me on that name, I don't have my notes in front of me. But he came up with the same idea that kind of thing could have been happening in the air. So they were using this Project Mogul back then to see if there were other explosions going on, atomic explosions in the atmosphere. Now, I'm saying that what I think crashed at Roswell was not Project Mogul, and it was not a weather balloon, but it was another secret project that they were working on that had to do with passive communications satellites. And that's what fits the description of what was found on the ranch near Roswell. I can't find anyone that actually saw a flying saucer land. And there was no in Roswell. And there was no flying saucer found, but there were parts of a metal substance that was unique. It was like a memory metal.
Right.
That was found there. And this was in 1947. Now, other things that don't come up too often that I can remember at all in any of the Roswell discussions is that there was another person by the name of a Dr. Robert H. Goddard that lived in New Mexico. He had a ranch in Roswell, and he was a rocket scientist. And to make a long story short, since 1945, the United States government was interested in these passive communications satellites. And what those passive communications satellites were referred to as satelloons. They were polyethylene, high-altitude balloons that were covered with metal. And that's what the Project Echo, if you remember Project Echo, those satellites, that's what Project Echo was. And according to my research, they were experimenting on those Project Echo type prototypes back then. So, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, a couple things. First of all, they're about, I think it was something like 60 miles further. There's reports of, people possibly seeing some type of Volkswagen-sized object separate, from all this. And, some people reported bodies and, possibly one still alive. And the thing we'll talk about as we go along here, but the government, of course, lied. I'm sure you know about this. At least I think 4 or 5 times on different occasions, and so that's I want to kind of unravel why do you think they lied even back in the 1990s. But before we get into that part of it, though, let's keep going. I want to hear more about the materials of this particular. I guess you wouldn't call it a satellite, or it's high altitude balloons. And go ahead.
Yeah. It was technically back then. There was a science fiction writer in 1945. I think his name was Clark, and he came up with a concept of these. They were considered to be passive communications satellites. What they would do is basically there were these huge satellites eventually that they would bounce microwave signals off of or whatever. And again, I found government reports that reported that in 1945 this was written about it and they already had the idea proposed. But even in 1942, there were people that were talking about taking signals and bouncing them off of, I think it was Venus and back, as communication satellites, because it was much cheaper to do that than to run a what's it called, a subatlantic cable or whatever.
Oh, wow!
And so I found all of these, thousands of pages of reports. I'm basing this all on my reports. I'm not making any of this up, and it's all documented. So in 1945, that whole idea was in the mix. And the United States government made that a top priority because one thing, the United States hadn't launched any satellites yet in 1945.
Right.
And there were studies that came out. It might have been from the RAND Corporation, but I'm not sure, that said if the United States would launch a satellite of some sort, that would be a real feather in our cap. And also, it would be for the whole idea of world peace, the ability of the world communicating with each other could be completed with I believe 3 passive communications satellites. And what these satellites were, they were just basically big balloons that were coated with metal. And that's all really the Project Echo was in the 50s. So and there were proposals and there were committees and panels that had to approve these, let's call them satelloons, and how they were designed. So they were already in the works at that time. And in my opinion, going back to Project Mogul, which they didn't explain until I think it was 1995 or 96, that didn't come forward as a possible solution to what landed at Roswell or crashed at Roswell until 1996. So it was all that time they let people think what it was. They just try to come up with what it was. They didn't tell anyone that I can figure out. So the whole idea was that they were already experimenting with a type of what we would call today Mylar.
Mm-hmm.
That and Mylar really wasn't perfected totally until the 60s, but before that in the 50s they had something called BOPET, and before the 50s, in the 40s they had something called PET, which was a type of polyethylene material. I can't pronounce the second part of it, so it's called PET balloons, and they were in place since 1941. The product PET. Now, to make again a long story short, when the regular weather balloons, they try to claim it was first. They try to claim that Roswell was first a weather balloon.
Well, first, getting back to the point I made, first they said it was a flying saucer. And that's I want to know why they would say that. I mean, what your thoughts are on that.
I'll tell you. Here's why.
You're getting there? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I'll do this. I'll do that now. So you won't be in suspense.
No, that's okay. No.
Okay, here's why. I was getting there, but I was taking the long way around.
Okay.
The long way home. Watch, the TV will go out again.
Yeah,
But what? Okay, so these passive communication satellites, they needed to be made out of a material like Mylar. But these were precursors to Mylar, and those technically balloons were made out of a flat, flexible, non-expansive material called PET. Back then, that was they learned how to coat with aluminum, okay? And they couldn't make them into a sphere at first. They made them by taking two pieces of round material and then somehow welding those two pieces together. So when you blow that up with air or whatever, it doesn't have a sphere. It looks like a disc. If you see, if you look at today's even Mylar balloons, they don't look perfectly round like a rubber balloon. If you take a look at them, they look a little bit like a disc. So those early balloons, I got some kind of symbol that said right in front of me, so I don't if they're agreeing but those early balloons up until 50 some, okay, were disc shaped. So and then the article that the science fiction writer Clark wrote back in 1945, and that's published and it's out there. His article is titled Extra-Terrestrial Relays. So they were actually referring to it, and what those relays were these big disc-shaped satelloons. And he wrote them up. So technically, once you got one of those, let's call it, for lack of better words now, a Mylar balloon, and it was coated with aluminum, and it was flying, it technically was an extraterrestrial flying disc. And that's what they were described as back in the 1940s. So someone could have They wouldn't have been lying, but it would have been an extraterrestrial, meaning they were designed to be off of the Earth. And the whole, I think Clark's original concept was to have 3 of those. And that would serve for communication systems for the entire world. So these balloons, these satelloons, would have been extraterrestrial flying discs that were aluminum coated polyethylene to some extent.
Now, were there supposedly ropes to a balloon, or was this all was the helium or whatever gas they were using at the time? Was that actually in that disc-shaped object they're talking about?
Whatever they would have been experimenting with things inside that flying extraterrestrial flying disc. They would have been something to cause it to go up. Okay, in our atmosphere, they wouldn't have needed that same stuff when it was in a high altitude. So they were testing some of those polyethylene balloons, metallized balloons. They were testing them to see how high they could go and what would happen with air pressure inside and so forth, because this was a whole new ball game for the people working with those. And they had a person that they brought in to work on making those balloons.
Now, you obviously found all this information, I'm assuming, online. Is this through government, or where did you find all this information?
I can't tell you that. No, I'm just kidding.
Your screen's going to go black again.
Yeah, again. But no, these were government reports that I found that were, I think they were declassified. Plus, I lived in Roswell. I didn't live in Roswell, but I was on an anti-gang task force that met in Roswell. So I had been to Roswell quite a few times, and I talked to people in Roswell who were connected to, New Mexico is connected to the whole space program. I mean, it's a big, New Mexico, a lot of things were done there. And I actually spoke with people that confirmed that what I was talking about was true. And on top of that, they would have needed, now Robert Goddard, who lived on a ranch in Roswell that I hardly ever hear anyone talk about. Now, even though he died in 1945, he was working on rockets. And he was working with a team of individuals on rockets. The way the passive communications satellite system was designed, they would have had to launch those into a high altitude space in those rockets. And around 1959, they were experimenting with that. And one of the satelloons exploded because it didn't unfold properly. You got to fold this great big 100-foot balloon into like the size of an oatmeal can. And when it exploded, the same kind of material was disseminated around the East Coast that they found on that ranch in Roswell.
All right. Well, I'm listening. I'm not. I'm being open-minded about this, and it really would be interesting after all these years if you actually had an idea what's going on. There's a lot of witnesses that have, firsthand witnesses. There's not too many left right now, so this Jesse Marcel was stating. Someone put this in chat. He was stating there was no way that he could hit it with a hammer. He couldn't dent it, but it would fold and then fold back. Are you saying that these are the properties of this? I forget what you called it, like PET or whatever it was,
Yep.
pre-Mylar.
The prototype that they would have been working on would have been able to do that. In fact, I have testimonies of other witnesses. There's only a handful of witnesses that actually handled those materials that day. And technically, when you go back to the whole Roswell incident, that's all they had were the people stating that odd metal must have come from a flying saucer. But at least one of the witnesses that handled that material that day said that it was not extraterrestrial in nature, that it was, something from Earth, and that they were, there's evidence that they were experimenting with those kind of materials back then. No one just knew it. I even have photographs of discs that are aluminum coated inflatable discs from back when they were doing the prototypes and working on them, and they were different sizes before they got to the real big ones. But they really didn't get into a spherical shape totally until like the 1950s. So they were discs for a while, and they kept on getting the metal kept on getting more and more rigid. So they had to have been experimenting with that kind of a metal that was memory shape, and they had to have it do that. At the time the Roswell incident happened, they would have had to have been experimenting with that for that project to have gone on.
Well, I understand, the secrecy, but they supposedly combed the field to get every single scrap of material up, and they went out of their way, according to some witnesses, to confiscate anything that people were squirreling away.
Right.
And that just it's kind of curious why material. I know it's experimental, but nothing that it doesn't seem like it would be of top secret nature. Why they would be so involved in making sure they got every last tiny little scrap up of that. Do you think that it was that important?
Yes, because again, the research I've done, the fact of having those kind of communication satellites would have been a world priority and would have put the United States in front of any other country as far as the space race would go. Plus, one account put that, at least one account stated that Marcel and Ramey, when those materials were allegedly recovered from Roswell by Marcel and some people, and then they were flown to Fort Worth, Texas, where it was examined by Ramey and another officer, and the officers knew that what they were looking at were not from a weather balloon, and they knew it really, they didn't want to say that it was from Project Mogul, but I've seen witnesses' testimonies that what they saw was, it was not a weather balloon, that they actually staged that one photograph that was out there. And there's some pretty reliable sources that claim that. And they really didn't, that was in 47, and they really didn't even come forward and say it was Project Mogul until 95 or 96. And there were some witnesses that came forward from it was a school in New Mexico that were launched that Project Mogul balloon that day from New Mexico. And my way of thinking, what they were possibly doing was since these Project Mogul were like balloon trains with large balloons in them, they were probably testing the Mylar-coated balloons by putting them in as part of those balloon trains. Since they were already high-altitude balloon trains, they could have been testing those Mylar-coated ones with devices on them to see about the pressure and so forth. That's one way they could sneak those in without people seeing flying discs flying around.
So still getting back to the headline, just one more time. You think that they made an honest mistake thinking that at first they had a flying disc? Because they called it in one press release, they called it a flying saucer. Another one, they called it a flying disc. But they were alluding to the fact that they had something extraterrestrial when they first came out. Of course, they recanted the following day in Fort Worth, like you said. So what are your thoughts on that in general?
If it was one of those prototype satelloons, it would have been a metal-coated flying disc if anyone saw it in the air. From the research that I saw, no one saw it in the air. They only saw the pieces on the ground. But if someone saw one of those balloons, either as part of a Project Mogul train or in addition to that Mogul train, it would have technically looked like an extraterrestrial flying disc that was made out of a polyester coated with metal. And the descriptions that I've read in a couple of cases of that metal, the people that actually handled it described it as like an aluminum coated, pliable but flexible yet not stretchable material.
So are you saying basically that one hand doesn't know what the other is doing? In other words, the Army Air Force at Roswell had no idea that these crafts were up in the air and being tested? Is that what your thoughts are?
Yes, but here's what that one of those other points that I made. Here's what I'm finding out, that what's happening back then and even now, they talk about disclosure and cover-up. It wasn't just the government that was covering it up. There were ufologists that were making statements that they thought were true that weren't. So there were also scientists in the government were making statements that they thought were true that weren't. There were some people making true statements. And what was just like this perfect storm of conflicting information that creates a situation where you have all this conflicting information. Some of it's reliable, some of it's not reliable. And when you get that kind of a perfect storm with all kinds of information, and I've documented that from all those different sources, you can't solve a problem, especially a problem as big as UFO phenomena. So what was happening is that there was so much information coming out, some of it disinformation, some of it misinformation, some of it accurate information, that it was causing it to be covered up without having to try to cover it up.
Very convoluted. So,
and I found evidence of that.
So, if the government actually didn't come clean in 1996, I think you mentioned earlier. I know there was a senator that there was a hearing with the Air Force. Why wouldn't they finally just come clean, with the whole situation and just say what they were doing? I mean, after all this time, it shouldn't matter.
Well, again, depending on what they were really doing with that. Now, let's and again, I'm just throwing this out as an example. Let's say what I think would happen was that there were one of those metal-coated satelloons was either part of one of those balloon trains or it was on its own being tested. If lightning would have hit that, and there are some indicators that there was a storm that night and that's what supposedly caused this crash, the saucer to crash. And that's technically what happened. If, let's say, someone was trying to bring that satelloon down or was connected somehow, I've seen videos of lightning or electricity hitting a Mylar balloon, and it just blows up. And it would tear the clothing and the skin and the hair and everything possibly off of anyone that was near it.
Wow.
So if I'm not saying that happened, if that happened, that could possibly still be covered up. I mean, there could be reasons. Like I said, when I was doing research with the Kecksburg incident, I found out that even though things were supposed to have been declassified, they weren't. So if there was some kind of disaster connected to it, and again, I don't know, and I'm not convinced that there was that where people were killed. But if that happened or something like that happened, they wouldn't let it go. Now I know myself, and having to deal with secret and top secret material, in some cases I can't tell about that for the rest of my life. And I had talked with an attorney about this, and for example, if I write a book that had top secret material in it, the government could go and remove the book off of the shelves.
You do realize that if you actually have solved this, that you're going to have a heck of a lot of pushback, because it's like the number one American UFO, or possibly the number one UFO case of all time, right?
You think?
You're going to get a lot of pushback out. Some of it's coming through the chat room. Yeah.
But here. Well, I'm going to change my name.
Yeah, I would.
What would I change it to? It's already but I did. There was and I won't mention where or when, but there was an article about this. My article published about just the Roswell case, not the Kecksburg and Roswell comparison, and nobody pushed back.
Well, it will happen, of course. I mean, they have diners, they have the Roswell Museum. You're going to be very unpopular. You'll just have to live with it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. A number of people in the chat room, they're saying, well, where's the evidence? I think that's kind of what we've wanted to get, from the flying saucer, so to speak, is we have no evidence of that either. Now, what do you say that you have is closest to evidence?
Testimonies of people that handled the material and possible material. I don't have it.
What about the little I-beams? Jesse Marcel Jr. talked about these little I-beams that had sort of purple and hieroglyphics on them. What about that? Is that part of something you looked into at all?
Yes. One of the scientists, now these Project Mogul balloons, they were launched from Alamogordo, New Mexico, some of them, which is right not that far away from Roswell. And they the team that launched that, and I happen to know because there were, let's say, scientists still living in New Mexico that were part of that launch team. They claimed that those types of materials were part of the Project Mogul. Now, what I'm saying is that I think that they were testing those satelloons as part of the Project Mogul, because they would have both been high altitude balloons.
So you think they were incorporated into the moguls in somehow? But why would it have hieroglyphics on it anyway? I mean,
well, I don't know that there were any hieroglyphics on the balloon. There were hieroglyphics on the little I-beams.
right.
But those I-beams, and again, I don't want to get into my sources, but the companies that those I-beams were bought from had those designs on them.
So, okay, interesting. So, getting back to the 1996, and again, I don't have the exact year when that happened. When
either 95 or 96, somewhere there.
Yeah. The subject of the bodies came up, and at the time, the government, the Air Force, claimed that it was crash test dummies, which of course didn't come out until 5 years after the Roswell incident. But they, instead of looking or saying something logical, they said that they were crash test dummies. Again, adding more lies to the whatever type of cover-up it was. What about that part of it when people were talking about bodies and that other, like I mentioned earlier, the Volkswagen size, vehicle that was found, and I forget exactly how many miles away, 40 miles away or 60 or something like that?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things. I've never found any evidence that satisfies me that there were actual bodies discovered to the original Roswell crash. Now, so I'm really not convinced that those bodies were linked to what was found on that ranch. But I did talk, and again, I lived in New Mexico, and I worked and I talked to people. There were a lot of space junk things flying around New Mexico. And that could have been anything. There were people, because of that cowboy culture, that's what you have to take into consideration. People were shooting off rockets all the time. And just for, fun. And, when I worked in Truth or Consequences for a while there, where they had that, that space station or whatever was built down there. And a lot of the experimental things that they launched from there didn't make it. And I had friends that would shoot stuff up in the air just for fun, and 4th of July or whatever. So there were quite a bit of rocket pieces all scattered throughout New Mexico.
Wow.
It could have been anything.
Yeah. So the only part, I guess, I think this is really fascinating. And the only part I find it a little tough to understand is why, after all this time, why didn't the government just plain admit that this was an experimental situation? I mean, it's kind of silly now. I mean, there's the Roswell Festival. There's so many people, involved in, the celebration and the mystery and books and all that. And so why wouldn't the government just plain come out and say, hey, look, this was an odd-shaped, aluminum-coated Mylar type experimental thing that happened, and that's end of story. That's it. Why wouldn't they just admit it and get it over with and stop all this?
Well, it's a multifaceted situation. Now, just like you were saying, someone's thinking in mind, well, if they really come forward and show all this, there goes the whole Roswell ceremony, and that whole event. And this, if like I'm saying, this cover up that I'm looking at is bigger than just the government, okay? It's keeping stuff quiet. They don't want it to go away. They want to keep using it. They want the UFO component to be part of the cover-up mix, so it will take forever for anyone to really figure out what's going on with the whole UFO phenomenon. It has to be a big, confused mix for the whole cover-up to work.
Well, there's certainly, I don't agree with one part of that statement, and you're saying the whole UFO, cover up or the whole UFO, because there are definitely things that are seen that are unexplainable, constantly and ever since. So you're not thinking that everything that's happening is something to do with the government, are you?
No. But I'm talking about UFO in the sense of being from another planet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that there are things that I think what's happening is that there are things out there that are from private industry that are putting them up there, like SpaceX or whatever, and that's part of the mix too. In fact, one thing I found fascinating in researching the Roswell event is that there were private companies at that time that had more money than the government did, and they were funding the passive communication satellites programs whereby the government couldn't fund it. So there were definitely at least one point, and I don't know that whole corporate cronyism mix, but there are definitely private people out there that are, funding things. And I know when I worked for the government, and part of my job was to look at technological innovations that were going on, and I had to sign non-disclosure programs or agreements. Anything I saw in a private lab was anywhere from 15 to 50 years ahead of what was out there on the market. And most of them weren't government projects.
Okay, so basically, are you, I just want some clarity here in your thoughts, if I could. Are you thinking that there is, that every UFO that's seen is explained away, or could be explained away as a government or private contractor experimental type of craft or something that people are seeing? Or do you think there's a possibility of just, we don't know?
We don't know. That's where I'm coming from. Because, for example, you've got other dimensions to look into. And since I think it was 2001, I believe it was NASA found a cold spot in the microwave background that they feel was kind of like a gateway to a multiverse approach. Also, I feel right now that there is extraterrestrial life out there. I believe that. Especially working with Project SETI or whatever. And my prediction is within 10 years, give or take 3 years, we will have some kind of physical communication. But it's highly likely that we're looking at holograms in some cases.
Wow.
Instead of physical ships.
Interesting. Well, it sounds like you're having a little bit of trouble there. Again, it's probably the it's probably the government after you. Your screen hasn't gone black, but we have just a couple minutes left. You have a website, right?
Yes. It's bobwenzelgross.com.
Bob?
www.bobwenzelgross.com.
Okay. And like I said, we just have a few minutes left here. Your book that's coming out. What do you have a working title for that?
I just completed my most recent newest book that I just had it's drafted, and I have a proposal that I have. The title of that one is, and this is a single book, it's not a series. The title is The True Nature and Value of Phenomena Known as UFOs.
Okay. Hey, Bob, I'm going to have to cut this short. We are done. So I want to thank you so much for being on the show, and good luck with that. Stay healthy and stay safe after you release all that information. All right.
Thank you.
All right.
I'll try to close this down here.
All right. You take care.
Thank you so much.
All right. You bet. All right, everyone. So that's it for our show tonight. Thanks so much. We have MJ Banyas here coming up next week. I want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. We have Evan in the background. We have our guests, Dr. Bob Gross, Alejandro Rojas, and Peggy Shunning for running the Facebook page. And thank you, KGRA Radio. And we'll be back same time next week. And that's it. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky.
That's a wrap.